The teen social media ban is becoming a costly digital illusion, and Britain is walking straight into it. Australia's teen social media ban is already exposing the fatal flaw in Starmer's UK plan. The ban that was supposed to settle the argument. Australia's under-16 social media ban was meant to be the proof point. It was sold as the world-leading answer to a real parental fear: children trapped inside algorithmic feeds, exposed to strangers, addictive design, bullying, sexualized content, and the emotional churn of platforms built to keep them scrolling. The argument was simple enough to win support. Draw a line at 16. Force the platforms to comply. Give childhood back. But the early reality is already messier. Australia's own model places responsibility on platforms rather than children or parents, with age-restricted platforms required to take reasonable steps to prevent under-16s from holding accounts. Platforms can face court-imposed penalties of up to $49.5 million, while children and parents are not penalized for access. That structure creates the central contradiction. The public hears ban, but the legal mechanism is not a police officer at the bedroom door. It is a compliance fight between regulators, platforms, age assurance vendors, lawyers, privacy rules, and teenagers who already know how the internet works. That is not a clean ban. It is a permanent enforcement problem. Australia is tightening because the first version has not solved it. Australia is now considering tougher enforcement because the current system has not delivered the clean result politicians implied it would. The Prime Minister has said he wants the law to be as strong as possible and able to withstand legal challenges, while the regulator and communications minister have been preparing action against major platforms. Reports now point to continuing evidence that teenage use has changed far less than the political messaging suggested. The most damaging figure is not abstract. A paper cited in recent reporting found 85% of Australians aged 12 to 15% were still using social media 3 months after the ban took effect, based on a study of 408 adolescents. 2/3 of underage users reportedly stayed online, either by self-declaring an age over 16 or by submitting a selfie that the platform accepted as over 16. That is the warning for Britain. A ban that teenagers can root around becomes a symbolic law with a very expensive enforcement tail. It may change the politics of the issue, but it does not necessarily change the behavior it claims to stop. Worse, it may push teenagers away from visible, regulated platforms and into less visible spaces where parents, schools, and regulators have even less leverage. The failure is not a glitch. The point. The enforcement problem is not a temporary bug. It sits inside the entire idea. To stop under-16s from having accounts, a platform must know who is under 16. To know that, it needs some method of age assurance. That might mean self-declaration, facial estimation, document checks, device-level signals, App Store verification, third-party identity tools, or a layered system combining several of them. Australia's own regulator has identified the weakness. Its compliance update noted concerns about children retaining or regaining accounts, perceived platform inaction when reports are made, and a lack of notable change in certain online harm complaints involving under-16s with age-restricted accounts. The update also recorded that some educators saw children celebrating their ability to circumvent the rules. The most brutal detail is how basic some of the evasion appears to be. The regulator's material says it is likely many Australian children under 16 have been able to create accounts by simply declaring they are 16 or older without being flagged for any age check. That is not a sophisticated cyber attack. That is a teenager doing what teenagers have done since the internet began, typing the date of birth that gets them through the gate. The cost of enforcement will not stay neatly with big tech. The political sales pitch says platforms will pay. That is only partly true. Platforms may pay fines, build compliance systems, and absorb engineering costs, but enforcement does not exist in a vacuum. Regulators need staff, legal resources, technical expertise, appeal systems, investigations, evidence gathering, public communications, and enforcement capacity. The more the ban fails in practice, the more the state has to spend trying to make it look real. Britain is already walking into that trap. The UK government has said it plans to use the Australian model while going further, including restrictions on live streaming and stranger communication with children, with measures expected to come into force in spring 2027. It has also said Ofcom will conduct a rapid study on effective age assurance, and that the government will ensure Ofcom has the funding it needs to implement and enforce new duties. That sentence matters more than the headline. Funding it needs is the quiet admission that this will not be cheap. A serious under-16 ban needs a serious enforcement machine. If Labour wants a tougher version than Australia, it should be honest about the bill. Not just the financial cost, but the privacy cost, the bureaucracy cost, and the inevitable drag on legitimate adult users who may be forced to prove they are not children. Tech companies are not quietly accepting the new order. The platforms are not responding, as if this is a settled moral consensus. Australia's regulator has been investigating major platforms, including Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and Snapchat, over suspected breaches, while the government has gathered evidence for possible court action if compliance does not improve. Platforms face large penalties, but the technical and legal dispute over what counts as reasonable steps is exactly where the fight now sits. There is also a legal challenge dimension. Reddit has challenged Australia's ban in the High Court on free speech grounds, while the government has said it will defend the law. That matters, because the policy is no longer just a child safety rule. It is becoming a test case for how much power democratic governments can place between citizens and digital speech platforms. This is where Starmer's plan becomes politically vulnerable. Labour wants the emotional authority of child protection, but it also inherits the practical burden of enforcement. If the platforms resist, Labour looks weak. If Labour forces them harder, it moves closer to a broader proof-of-age internet. The more serious the policy becomes, the harder it is to pretend adults will remain untouched by the machinery built to identify children. Starmer's plan copies the model before the model has proven itself. The UK government has explicitly said it plans to use the same model as Australia, covering user-to-user platforms built around social interaction, posting. Algorithms, including Snapchat, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and 10th. It also says messaging services like WhatsApp and Signal are not intended to be included. But Labour is not merely copying Australia. It says Britain will go further, with blocks on functions such as live streaming and stranger communication for under 16s across a wider range of online services, including gaming sites. Restrictions on those functions will also be on by default for 16 and 17-year-olds. And the government is looking at overnight curfews and breaks in infinite scrolling for under 18s. That turns the policy from a social media ban into a wider digital behavior regime. The state is no longer only asking whether a child can use Instagram. It is asking what features a teenager can use, when they can use them, who they can speak to, what platforms count as risky, what counts as communication with strangers, and how platforms must prove compliance. This is much bigger than a ban. It is a regulatory redesign of youth internet access. The anti-Labour problem is competence, not concern for children. The strongest argument against Starmer's plan is not that children face no online risks. They clearly do. The strongest argument is that Labour is reaching for a highly visible state intervention before proving it can enforce the basics. Australia's experience shows the danger large fines, regulatory investigations, account removals, information notices, and public campaigns can still leave huge numbers of teenagers online. That makes Starmer's line in the sand language look politically attractive, but technically thin. The UK government says tech companies have failed and that ministers are stepping in to protect children. But stepping in is easy in a press release. Making a 15-year-old stop using a phone, browser, VPN, sibling account, gaming chat, private server, or alternative platform is a different matter. Labour's instinct here is classic Starmerism. Define a problem, centralize authority, empower the regulator, instruct industry, promise enforcement, then present control as competence. But digital life does not behave like a Whitehall process map. The internet roots around friction. Teenagers route around rules. Companies route around liability. Parents are left trying to enforce a policy whose actual operation they may not understand. The real risk is a ban that fails downward and expands upward. The danger is not only that the ban fails. The danger is that it fails downward and expands upward. It fails downward if children still find their way onto platforms. It expands upward if adults are increasingly drawn into age checks, identity systems, and verification processes because platforms cannot otherwise prove they are excluding under 16s. That is why Australia matters so much. It shows that the simple version of the policy does not survive contact with reality. If a child can bypass the system with a false date of birth, the state demands tougher checks. If tougher checks create privacy concerns, the state demands safeguards. If safeguards create loopholes, the state demands more enforcement. Each failed layer becomes the justification for the next. Britain should treat Australia's enforcement struggle as a warning, not a template. Starmer can call it child safety. Labour can call it world leading. Regulators can call it age assurance. But the deeper truth is harder to escape. Once a government promises to keep every under 16% off social media, it has promised something only an intrusive, costly, and imperfect enforcement machine can even attempt to deliver.